Hi, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Building Win-Win RPO Relationships, Case Study Sonos. My name is David Goodstein, and I am a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It's our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with TalentFusion. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to quickly tell you about the questions box. We encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do so, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click the submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 1 day, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about the Outsourcing Institute for those who aren't familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. OI specializes in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you in this market, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this arena. Our contact information is at the bottom of the screen for those who have any questions. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Larry Heckathorn, co-founder of the Human Capital Group. Larry?
Thanks, David. This is Larry Heckathorn, co-founder of the Human Capital Group. We work very closely with the Outsourcing Institute. But to give you a little bit of my background, I spent a number of years with Alcoa, where I was a client in the outsourcing business. Headed up a lot of the HR functions globally there, and moved on to Arthur Andersen as a partner and Ernst & Young prior to forming Human Capital Group. We spend a lot of our time assisting organizations and clients through the decision-making process in outsourcing. With that, I'd like to introduce David Pollard, President of TalentFusion. David, why don't you give a little bit of background and experiences that you carry with you?
Well, thank you, Larry, and thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar today. I'm the president and founder of TalentFusion, which I started in 2000, and have spent the last 13 years growing the business in the RPO arena. I've known Jim, who I'll introduce in a second, since our days in the IT outsourcing arena back in the 90s, and we've spent numerous years and long trails together as we've carved a path through recruitment and recruitment services together, and it goes all the way back to those early days in the 90s with the IT services arena that went through a very similar rapid curve that we're about to enter in the RPO arena. So just happy to be here. And again, Larry, thanks for the intro. And with that, Jim, I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Larry, and thanks everyone else for joining in and having me today. I lead our global recruiting function here at Sonos. Sonos is the wireless hi-fi music company, bringing streaming music to every room in your house wirelessly. I've got a pretty long history, 25-plus year history of in recruiting. I grew up as a recruiter. I've spent a huge part of my professional life in this profession, which I have a great deal of respect for our profession, and I've led. You'll see, I think there's a slide that shows some of my bio. I've led some large organizations, either as the strategic leader or the leader of the entire global recruiting function over about the last 15 years or so. And as David said, we've got a history going back, and I think it's a very important distinction to make that we do have some history, because it's part of how you get to know the folks that you work with when you've got experience working side by side with them. And I think some of that will shine through in a lot of the content you're going to hear today. Larry?
Yeah, and just as a general housekeeping note, we're going to have a couple polling questions we're going to ask the participants to join us in. One of them at the beginning, that's coming up next, one of the next slides. We're going to ask you to complete your position in a couple questions, and the second question will be at the end of the presentation. So, David, if you could move on to that first polling question, that would be great. So here it is. What is your current role as it relates to RPO? We'd like you to click on one of the three boxes if you wouldn't mind. Are you a current buyer of RPO services? Are you a client who's considering buying RPO services? Or are you an RPO vendor providing RPO services? So if you all wouldn't mind clicking on one of those three buttons so that we can get a general demographic for the group, that would certainly be helpful. We'll give you a few seconds here to get that completed, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, now that it looks as though we have completed that. Have we completed that, David, or are we still waiting on a couple of people to click a box?
Yeah, it's completed.
Okay, with that being completed, what I'd like to do is turn the mic over to David and get started on today's presentation. David.
Great, thank you, Larry. We're going to cover some pretty meaty topics today. We're going to do it in kind of rapid-fire fashion. We have a limited window, and there may be some questions at the end. Please don't hesitate to ask questions throughout using the chat bar. But what we're going to try to plow through is just an overview of the rapidly changing environment that we all operate in. There's some new business models that are rapidly emerging on the scene. Most importantly, I want to turn it over to Jim in the heart of the presentation so that he can talk through what it's like to be a buyer of RPO services, at least from TalentFusion. And it's not just Sonos. We've done business with Jim in several different capacities, and I'll let him talk about that. But to his point earlier, the relationship as a foundation for a successful RPO relationship is paramount here, and I'm sure he'll talk about that. So briefly, technology's impact on recruitment and what that means to us as recruiters, recruitment service providers, and what buyers of these services should be thinking about as they look at the next wave of this. And then some, to the extent we can, some future view as we try to look into a crystal ball of what might be coming our way, what we're seeing on the horizon as a vendor in the space, and what buyers of the service should be aware of that we think is on the way. Okay, David. Obviously, we're seeing a very rapidly changing environment right now in our industry. I like to think of this as the third wave of RPO. I was here right from the beginning, so I saw the first crest of very early adoption in this space prior to there even being an acronym RPO. And those were some daring customers that were willing to take a shot at this without much definition and structure, and we enjoyed some early success with that. And then the recession in 2001, and of course, tragically 9/11, brought an end to that first wave of buying of most of everything in the space. And then we had a second wave emerge post-recession in 04, 05 that really brought in some of the big players into the arena, starting to nibble at the space, the big staffing providers, and we'll talk about those more in a minute, and some of the headhunters and certainly even the large systems providers started looking at BPO, specifically RPO, as possibly a method to drive revenue and penetration to the client community. And we're now in what I see is the third wave, where the big box providers are clearly taking this industry seriously now. There is clearly a sandbox that we all play in that's been defined by, in large part, by both the early adopters like TalentFusion and a few others, as well as the credibility that comes with the IBMs and the Connexes and the Adecos and the Korn Ferries coming in and help shaping the space. But we're seeing some really transformation level consolidation and expansion going on. We've all seen the acquisitions and the private equity moves that have been made in the past couple of years. I would suggest that that is just beginning to take shape, and it's very logical that that happens right now. Money is moving off the sideline from the private community, private equity community, and that's helping to reshape the configuration of players that are out there, and there's a slew of M&A activity as a consequence of that. The other driver, of course, is global. I mean, everything is global, even small to mid-size companies have divisions overseas. Jim, of course, is subject to that, and most mid-sized companies that we deal with have some kind of global footprint, and that's driving change in their world and span of control issues in their world that lend themselves to maybe looking at a global view of RPO to help solve some of those things. The capital structures in terms of private equity, looking for a home, and the way these companies are capitalized, and the money that is looking for a home is now interested in services and business process outsourcing as an outlet for that investment opportunity. And so that is certainly driving a lot of change. We've seen large private equity firms that here to date have really only been interested in scalable technology plays are now very interested in business process outsourcing and RPO, and you're seeing the headlines starting to cross the board on those activities as they move their money off the sideline into our space. And there's a lot of reason for excitement because of that. Certainly from a vendor's perspective, we're excited because we were here at the beginning, and we're proud of that in and of itself, but also we think we benefit greatly from the breadth and heft of a larger industry, of the larger players, the Adecos and the Spherions of the world, taking this space very seriously and moving their, capital off the sidelines, if you will, to give, credibility to the industry. However, there's also some concerns there. There's pitfalls associated with that changing and evolving marketplace that buyers certainly need to be aware of, and they need to know, who they're doing business with and why, and, what the capital structures are of the business they're doing business with, and, are they committed to the space for the long term? Is it core competency? Things like that can evolve and change as the money moves in and shapes the thinking about how the company that they've invested in does business. So there are some things to kind of be aware of on that front. To net it out, it's a very rapidly evolving space right now, a very exciting time. We're at what one of my bosses in the 90s called a point of inflection in this space, as they were in IT services, and I think there's a lot of room for future growth. All right, David. Just to draw the parallel very quickly, and mainly because Jim and I both lived through this, so it's a nice kind of metaphor for what we view the trend that we're entering now with RPO. We were at Keene together in the early to mid-90s as they went from really sort of a mid-tier $100 million kind of player to where we exited that business in and around the year 2000 at $1.2 billion. So you had some early thought leadership with companies like Ross Perot's EDS and John Keene's Keene and a number of others that really broke the ground. And we feel to a certain extent the TalentFusions and the other nascent startups that really carved away in this industry that have now, some of which have exited, did the same thing for our industry. They formed it. They got people thinking about it. They got customers thinking that they might be in position to outsource portions of their human capital and talent acquisition capabilities. And we had to answer some of the same questions the EDSs and the Keenes did early on. What the heck is it? How does it work? And it's a little bit wide open in terms of the structure and the rules. Eventually, like now, in the last second wave, if you will, the big guys, the IBM, the Big Five, and the EDSs of the world move in and bring all that structure. And we've seen a parallel in the RPO industry as the big guys have moved in and given us credibility and a set of rules and regulations to live by. Then there's this third wave, and we're in that now here, and I think this is really where it can get very exciting and a little daunting, because we saw this certainly in the late 90s when we had a whole slew of startup IT, e-commerce, web development companies sneak in and make big names for themselves as cracks formed in the big box view of IT outsourcing in the late 90s. And the big players, the IBMs and even the EDSs and certainly the Big Five, demonstrated weakness and soft underbelly in their ability to develop cutting-edge solutions like e-commerce and internet and now, of course, mobile. And so a whole flight of new providers swooped in, similar to where we are in RPO today, where there's a whole slew of new companies that have emerged, and they're filling the gaps in the large box players' capabilities in terms of very vertical and niche and precise solutions. And so that wave is going to include all of that. It is including all of that while we consolidate, while there is a much more clear view on the buying community's part as to what they need and what they want. So it's a very volatile, exciting, dynamic, and fluid environment that we're operating in. And I think buyers need to really, really be aware of that. David? So some of the things that are being looked at, and then we'll very quickly get to the heart of this, which is really Jim's experience on the buyer side of all this. We're seeing some real clear trends here. The big box end-to-end RPO is under review. There was a slew of deals in the 2005 to 2010 timeframe that was indicating the formation of a big box enterprise-wide marketplace for RPO, and deals were cut, and those deals are still being cut. Having said that, I think as those contracts expire, as Everest reported, 500 of those RPO deals are now up for renewal. What we're seeing are indications that HR community on the buy side is taking a look at that end-to-end RPO and questioning it and wondering whether it's the way to go or whether there's other methods for building a world-class talent acquisition capability. And they're looking at specialization. They're looking at precision. Are we getting the real vertical domain expertise? Are we getting the sourcing capabilities that fill our most demanding and hard-to-find hires? Are we seeing the levels of service that are accommodating the needs of every buyer in our community as opposed to broad-based SLAs at the enterprise level? And I think there's a lot of questions being asked as to whether that end-to-end view in its purest form is really the most viable going forward. On top of all that, the buyers are sophisticated. We've seen a very clear trend towards rapidly maturing buy-side capabilities in terms of RFP build-out. They're asking the right questions. They know what they want, and they are challenging the enterprise-wide view of it as they have to answer to their internal constituencies on the buy side. They're seeking more than ever.
This is Larry with a real quick question from our participants on the topic you're speaking on right now, the buyer. One question is, considering total versus partial RPO outsourcing, what have you seen has changed the approach clients are using today?
Well, as I said, I think a lot of buyers 5 years ago, when they thought of RPO, and the analyst community did this as well, they thought of RPO as an enterprise-level buy. They thought of cradle-to-grave, end-to-end, people process technology outsourcing. And that's still, in some cases, the view of the RPO world. What we're seeing is a very rapidly rising interest in more precise views of RPO. For instance, technology recruitment process outsourcing for IT, very hard to find IT people, is very different than bank teller, large scale, enterprise-wide recruitment process outsourcing. So we're seeing increased interest reflected in the RFPs that come in demonstrating, asking us to demonstrate how we're able to fill those niche, mission-critical openings and how that's not going to get lost in the larger view of the enterprise-level RPO. We're seeing much more interest in on-demand, scalability, flexibility, scalable and flexible pricing models. Obviously, more than ever, companies are seeking to turn fixed costs into variable costs as much as they possibly can, and RPO can do that for them. Global orientation, which I mentioned earlier, is on everyone's mind. Virtually every company we do business with, from the SMB all the way up to the Global 1000, has a global orientation. They're concerned with implementation across a large span of control, and that's certainly affecting the view of a new business model in this third wave of RPO. So with all that, I'd like to introduce Jim again. He's been a buyer of RPO services from us in several different environments, both in the current one that he's in at a cutting-edge technology company in the audio industry, back to other bigger box buyers that I'll let him talk about. So he's had the spectrum, and he's watched the evolution with me and with TalentFusion from the early adoption stages back when he was at Keene and then Siebel, and all the way through to today, 15 years later at Sonos. So he's seen the evolution of this from the early adoption all the way through to the level of maturity. He's also been a driving factor in the thought process I just referred to on the buy side, where there wasn't a lot of clarity early on. It was kind of the Wild West, and now he knows exactly what he needs, and it's our job really to accommodate that in a very, very precise fashion. So with that, Jim, I will gladly turn it over to you.
Thanks, David, and I appreciate those comments. And David Goodstein, you can move on to the case study slide. It'd be great. And I want to, I'll keep as much as possible on a high level as an overview, but very happy and anxious to answer specific questions from participants as they come in. So Larry, feel free to chime in if questions do pop up. I think, first, two things I want to point out. One is it's really important to consider a lot of what David Pollard's comments were about the evolution of RPO. You get more of what you want and need today versus what they have. And I think if I had to put in the simplest terms, that's really what we've adapted to. Look, everybody was trying to figure this out. David, self-aware about that. What do buyers want to have? What do they need? What do the vendors have to offer? And a question that I asked David many years ago was, how can you build an on-demand model? And I was concerned about, one, I believe that I needed it, but two, I think good buyers take their vendors' success into account. And I learned that lesson many years ago. The more you help make your vendors successful, the better position you'll put yourself into. So I really, David and I had a lot of discussion around how can you make an on-demand model be profitable? How can we have there be continuity in this model? In other words, having the same people. And I'll talk in a little bit of a detail in just a second about that. But I think, those are some of the driving thoughts that have kind of taken place over the last 10 years around how best to take advantage and be opportunistic about this vendor-buyer relationship in a discipline that has been used to a combination of traditional contingent labor with traditional full-time labor. And it's taken all of us a lot of time, I think, to learn how to do this right. We've all made a few mistakes and had some hiccups along the way, but we learn from them and we talk through those things. So I'll turn my attention now specifically to Sonos, where we were, what we were thinking, and why we engaged with TalentFusion. We entered the conversation with David by walking him through our strategy, because those are the kinds of questions that TalentFusion has learned to ask. Instead of asking about nuts and bolts and mechanics, it's they've gotten really smart and learned how to deal with this strategy of an organization and really what their high, lofty goals are, rather than what do you need to get done today? Because the conversation will always come back to what do you really need to get done today. Unless you know what your customer, what the buyer's ultimate real goals are, it's hard to become successful. It's hard to build a implementation model that leads to an operational model that you don't have to struggle a little bit to be successful. So these are just some thoughts we had as we entered these conversations. Like so many other companies, we anticipate fluctuations in our hiring demand. So I can set out in the beginning of the year as we're doing budget forecasts and headcount forecasts and look at what the company's headcount demand is going to be and put some simple models in place that figure out how many resources I'm going to need in any one place to get the job done, and that's it's a necessity but it's something that many, many companies do. So we're no different in that regard. But we do know that, and we anticipate there might be some fluctuations. How do we manage that with confidence? We also are very keen to look for partners who can work in an on-demand model, who can demonstrate profitability and demonstrate confidence in an on-demand model. And for me, it's as simple as, how can you cycle in and out of our business to help us with this fluctuation in demand, should that be the case? But having a vendor who always knows who you are. It's implement once and repeat, repeat, repeat. I'm so pleased that we've gotten to a point in the evolution, David calls it the third wave, where vendors are really comfortable with this. TalentFusion, in this case, has declared that and behaved that way, that they're comfortable with it. We like it because it's not having to train somebody new every time they start up again. It's picking up the phone and calling and arranging on schedule for what kind of services we need, and very specifically, and we can count on it. So that was a very important part of our objectives. One of the other challenges I think we faced was how we, together as partners, could scale the sourcing volume. So, TalentFusion could come in and provide services to us that could even overexceed our expectations, but could we manage that scale very well? One of the adages I thought of in this was, be careful what you ask for. So if you ask for your vendor to come in and source a large number of folks, what are you going to do with those people once they've sourced them? And if you are resource constrained, which is maybe where you would be if you were in the situation where you're trying to manage fluctuations in hiring, you're already resource constrained. So one of the things we had to do was figure out a really good triage model and a really good, I think, the mechanics and the logistics of the pace and the cadence of sourcing, so that we could scale along with their scale to our demand. Another key element that we looked for in a partner was somebody who used similar tools. Doesn't always have to be the same tools. In our case, it was that we were an Aperture CRM user. TalentFusion was, I think, the earliest adopter of Aperture from a vendor's perspective, and fully embraced the value in CRM and the ability to work with a customer, whether it's with their tool or with the customer's tool or with TalentFusion's tool. And in our case, it allowed us to have a common language around technology, which was ideal because we wanted to use a lot of the efficiencies we got from using a tool like Aperture CRM, and also that we were able to house and maintain the data that was collected along the way, which was incredibly valuable to us. And maybe the most important element that we looked for when we were seeking out a vendor in this case was someone who wanted to be our partner and not just be a vendor. And being our partner to us means that you care enough about the outcomes of our business as much as you care about making sure that the financial terms of the deal are met. You care enough about the long-term value of what you can provide us versus the short-term value of getting the contract signed. And probably most importantly is, really good partners ask really good questions. And when you come in and you ask very intelligent questions about how you're going to help us become successful, it's meaningful to us, because then they're going to work with you, they're going to stand by you, and it thus has been the case in all my dealings with TalentFusion. So no big surprise that we made that choice, and we did, in full disclosure, we did evaluate a number of RPO firms, partly to prudent due diligence, and partly because hey, I have to understand what's out there in the marketplace to make sure that we are always in step with progression. But I'll tell you, in our case, TalentFusion came in, We had an incredibly meaningful engagement. The calibration of their effort and our needs was flawless. It didn't have a lot of discussion time. We weren't mired down in meetings over a long period of time, and we always felt at ease partnering. And one of the things that I used as a guidepost for that was how well would the recruiting team here at Sonos calibrate and then collaborate and find it ease to partner. And that was equally as easy as it was for me to go through the contract and implementation phase of this. So it was something that the team here embraced. In fact, they would sit around and develop new strategies for how they could be more opportunistic about the value of the folks that were working with us. And one of the things I always ask about when you're looking at different sorts of labor, are you looking for some strategic value? Are you looking for an extra pair of hands? And in this case, we're obviously getting strategic value, but I think of it as an extra pair of familiar hands. And that familiarity, to me, was incredibly important because there was an element of trust, a great deal of trust. It was somebody that I'd worked with for a great many years and had good success with. But there's a great deal of trust that wove through TalentFusion altogether in the way that they approached us, the way that they delivered their services, and in the communication. There wasn't anything that was so structured we couldn't break from that. It was very adaptable, met our business needs, and ultimately led to incredible success in getting us over several of our fluctuations in hiring demand. So let me stop there and see if there's any comments from David Pollard or if there are any questions, Larry, from any of the participants.
Well, Jim, that was very very kind of you, and thank you, and thank you for participating today and saying all those things. I'll just echo from a vendor standpoint. Jim touched on some critical success factors that everyone who's considering RPO, from whatever vantage point you're coming at it, needs to be mindful of. It can't just be a tactical bandwidth solution, although it may solve that. It can't just be a technology-based solution, although that is helpful, having Avature and other tool sets woven together into a part of our solution is helpful. It's got to be much more than that, and it can't just be an extra pair of hands, but it's got to be all of those things, and also an ability to strategically assist the client company in achieving their business goals. And it starts and ends there. What are the business goals, and did the RPO provider play a role in achieving them through the talent acquisition capability? So I think with Sonos and with many of the other clients that we've partnered with, those are some of the key elements and key attributes, and the level of engagement that a buyer of these services has to have should be underscored and not underestimated. To outsource anything isn't to simply get it off your books or get it off of your plate. It's still an engaged process, and to get the most value out of it, you have to have great engagement and calibration, and it has to be easy. And it's the RPO provider's job to make that engagement and calibration and the results that needs to drive easy for them to partner with.
Yeah, David, you touched on something that I didn't mention and I should have. As we evaluated our desire and necessity to engage with a vendor to outsource what I consider on-demand RPO, our motives were not entirely driven by a single number. It wasn't just a comparison of, is this less expensive to do than B or C. It was, what's our total investment going to be, and what is going to be the return on that investment in overall value to Sonos. And it wasn't really hard, terribly complicated algorithms to determine that. But I think it was lessons that I've taken from the past where we have, or I have looked at strictly at comparing cost A to cost B, and that was a mistake. And it was a mistake because it's not so much be careful what you pay for, or you get what you pay for. as much as it was having blinders on and not seeing the total value. You could end up with, the lowest cost vendor. I'm not suggesting that is the wrong decision, as long as you've taken a good considerate view of what is that total investment and what do you get for that total investment.
Great, thank you, Jim. I guess we can go to the next slide, David. Okay, just a few thoughts on technology, and some of these are fairly self-evident, but I think technology's impact on business process is profound and has been and will continue to be. One of the things in the RPO space that's been transformative is the advent of social media, the internet in general, and the visibility, the transparency that has transformed recruiting as a profession. When I came up as a recruiter, Jim as well, I'm sure, we were handed a telephone and a phone book, literally, and said, have at them. Here's some recs. Go fill them. Go find out. There was no internet. There was no job board. There was no database. There was no LinkedIn. There was really word of mouth, and you had to literally go and use the human factor in its purest form to go identify talent and bring it through the process. Now we're at a place where candidate identification that used to be, the Rolodex recruiting, the value of the headhunter, all those things is no longer the value prop it used to be. We all have equal and open access in some fashion or another to the entire population of talent on the planet in some kind of, unless someone is living in a spider hole somewhere, and if they are, they're probably not someone that we want to talk to. Everyone who is anyone is somehow, somewhere, visible to each of us. Therefore, as never before, ironically, it comes full circle to the human factor being really, really important again. The recruiter skills necessary to compete in an open environment where there's 100% transparency is huge. Their ability to sell an opportunity, their ability to apply their craft, and while they manage complex systems and big data and parsing it down to the hit list that they want to spend most time cultivating is paramount. So some of the old paradigms and models are even more important today given the fact that there's 100% transparency into the talent community. And what we're finding is that the recruiters need to add more value than just candidate flow. They really have to serve as a consultant to the business. We've talked about that over the years as being key drivers at every level, but now more than ever, when you remove the Rolodex, the file folder of candidates as proprietary domain expertise from the desk of a recruiter, it must be replaced with deep domain expertise about the business. You got to know it top to bottom, and it really matters to understand the client's business, whether you're on my side of the desk at an RPO provider level or whether you're on the corporate side as a buyer of RPO services or a corporate recruiter. You really need to know the business in a way like never before, because the differentiation that you bring isn't access to candidates, because we all have access to the same volume of candidates. It's a matter of, are you skillful in pulling them through your process? Are you skillful in terms of adding business value to your buyers at corporate or on our side? And are you bringing the domain expertise that positions yourself as a recruitment professional, as a business leader? Some of the things that are, you were all seeing and looking at, because the cycles are just so compressed now. It seems like yesterday when MySpace and early adoption social media sites were all the rage, and it begs questions about the next wave in keeping with those cycles and how compressed they can be. And we are seeing some compression even on leading edge solutions such as LinkedIn. This is not to suggest that LinkedIn is going anywhere anytime soon. They've done a marvelous job establishing themselves as the runaway leader in managing social media talent management and recruiting activities that benefit from that. However, what we're seeing, and I think buyers need to be aware of it, is that it isn't the panacea. It will not be the panacea any more than any of the early adoption job boards that came our way seemingly yesterday are any longer the panacea to recruitment. And there will be a next wave of whatever comes after
the LinkedIns of the world and the Facebooks of the world. But we are seeing some talent pulling their profiles down sometimes from LinkedIn, and there is a concern, I think, a little bit that there may be a saturation point. I'm not, again, suggesting that LinkedIn is anything but the marvelous tool that we all think it is, but I think we ought to be aware that any technology, and we've seen it in several different cycles, ATS all the way through to Avature CRM, all technology sets hit some kind of a wall, a speed bump, where there is a saturation adoption place that they get to, and people start looking for new answers, whether they be on the talent community side, looking to congregate in a different way, or the talent acquisition side of the equation, looking to get at that talent in a different way. And so there are some questions there about the future view of LinkedIn as the leading force in that. We're certainly seeing a whole slew of next generation models emerging as so many new RPO providers come into the arena and bring their intellectual capital with them and their ideas, the models, the pricing models, the delivery models. The blend of technology and people is ever evolving, and we're going to see some next generation models emerging from that experiment that will benefit the buyer community greatly. And of course, mobile. It's a mobile world. We all know that. The advent of mobile recruiting is upon us. I don't think anyone really knows what that means yet, but you don't have to know that we live out of our iPhone, we live on the road, we need to be able to transact business on the road. So you were certainly seeing a migration away from the big box kind of technology view of certainly ATS and applicant management and candidate sourcing into the mobile device, and obviously that's going to accelerate over the coming years.
If I can just add to that, David, you know, over the last 15 years, there's been, billions of dollars invested in technology, just very specifically targeted for recruitment. And for that investment, for the most part, recent survey data reports that there hasn't been a significant change in the time to fill or cost per hire or the quality of the people that are being hired. So if we look back on that and think to ourselves honestly, and listen, I'm a recruiting professional, I hold myself equally accountable for this. We've failed. We've failed in that investment. We're spending money and we're not getting anything back for it. But I think bigger than that is that we've allowed some evolution of thought to go to be drawn to technology because it's sexy, it's fun, and it's cool, and let that technology drive a strategy rather than stick to solid strategies that, by the way, can be quite progressive and innovative and be contemporary. And having those strategies then aligned with certain technologies to enable them. And I see that there are glimmers of that taking place today, where the inundation of all kinds of technologies overwhelmed people, and they've stepped back to the human factor and said, wait a minute, we really need recruiters. Now, here's our strategy. Now what kind of technology is going to really work for us? And I think we're seeing a lot of, I know I've talked to peers recently, they're talking about changes in investments in a variety of subscriptions and technologies that they use, that they're looking for a more light version of their ATS because they're using other systems to help manage their prospective candidate flow. And I think that's really smart thought. It's very progressive thought. My last point, and it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but you know, David was talking about some of the technology, LinkedIn and others up to mobile recruiting, and it dawns on me that there was a time when placing a job ad in a newspaper was revolutionary, and there was a time when you know the sudden, which I thought it was very sudden proliferation of sites like Monster Board, which is what it was originally called, and then you know Monster.com and Career Builder were really innovative and revolutionary. There was obviously, you know, the highly connected network-driven tools like LinkedIn and Facebook and others that are helping to drive further revolution and innovation in recruiting. And you know, mobile is yet another way people are going to get touched. But it all comes back to really the same kind of strategies of how do we best communicate with the audience we want to communicate with, and in what way do they want to be communicated with, and how do we enable that? So, we've taken the approach here at Sonos to invest our effort and our top goals on providing world-class candidate experience. Because if we're focused on what our candidates need and want, we feel very strongly that's a differentiator for us as in this competitive environment. But also, it's providing an element of something that looks more like what it would look like when they got here, and we feel good about that. And so that we get into a situation where we hire folks and onboarding becomes a validation instead of a teaching moment. So I think that there's been lots of evolutions of technology, and I'm really pleased to see some movement today with folks thinking about strategy first and applying technology to it afterwards to help enable it, but yet continuing to be progressive in their thought process.
This is Larry again with a quick question. Jim and Dave, you all have been touching on a number of the best practices, and one of the questions that's come in is, as an organization implements and even goes into ongoing servicing of an RPO process, there's often bumps in the road. Are there any specific, one or two pitfalls that you would suggest that the vendors or clients avoid if at all possible?
Well, I'll say, I'll answer that a little bit, and then Jim may want to chime in as well. I mean, obviously it starts with RFP construction to make sure that the document that hits the street really reflects the true business need of the organization, and because you can really go sideways in a hurry if it's too generic, too broadly defined, and looks to achieve too many business objectives. To have clarity built into that document, whether it's a formal RFP or maybe it's just a one-page back of a napkin checklist of things that are most important in terms of the client's need, and why are they doing this? Why are they considering bringing in an RPO partner? What is the specific business objective that we're looking to solve? And from that, the second thing, and that is born from that, is vendor selection. Not all vendors are the same. They're very different. And as I said earlier, there are some dynamite, just fantastic, large box, end-to-end RPO providers that solve a global footprint problem, that solve a span of control problem, that bring heavy financial capabilities to bear on a financially driven transaction. They may or may not be the right firm to outsource the hiring of 50 mission-critical engineers that are going to build out your next wave of e-commerce platforming that you're depending on to run the company or go to market with. So, but it's born out of the RFP thought process. What is the business problem we're looking to solve? How do we then map that need to the best possible community of RPO providers? And if you can get those two things in alignment, Larry, a lot of the problems that can occur when that doesn't happen just will not occur, and you'll have a good experience.
I think, thank you, David. I think the two answers that come to mind for me, the first of which is having a very transparent dialogue with a vendor. It's incumbent upon both sides to be really open and honest and talk about what's needed and what's required and what should be expected and what they should expect of you. And yes, an element of measures in there is to keep everybody honest. I think that's incredibly important. But the other side of it, and I think this is, anecdotally spoken, I encourage the buyer community not to be taken away by a large name solely because they're a large name and there's some comfort in your ability to get things approved. Oftentimes the bumps in the road come from all that complication that might come from a very large vendor, even if you're a large company yourself. And that's not to suggest that some of the large RPO vendors are complicated. Many of them are not. But I've seen and heard and talked about many cases where internal politics really was a huge driver in decisions. We were more comfortable using this company because 3 people have done business with that company before. And I knew I could get it approved versus who I thought would do the good job. Look, if you know what's going to work and you know it's going to be uncomplicated, and uncomplicated and simple are going to take all those bumps out of the road. I say display the courage to stand up for what you believe in. That may come in the form of a large company. I'm not suggesting it couldn't, but there's been so many cases where that kind of internal decision making was driven more about name than reputation. And maybe I will add a third. It really is okay to do some really solid references on vendors. It's okay to call and talk to folks that had to engage with them. Candidates, the recruiters, how did you like working with these folks? What was difficult? What didn't you like? What could have changed? What didn't transpire that you really believed would transpire? And I think just as you're hiring really well by doing references, I think you need to do references on vendors and learn about them.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I guess we're ready for the next foil. Okay, just very quickly, because we are running short of time. There is a lot of speculation as to what the future will look like. I'll just share some observations from our perspective. Co-sourcing of best-of-breed providers is very commonplace now. We are regularly matched up against a provider that does something better than we do and vice versa, and I think there's going to be much more of that. Again, with the big box analysis that's going on with RPO, I think there is a trend towards retention of the overall ownership level of the recruitment talent acquisition function within a corporation. I think we're heading to a world where less and less of that is going to be outsourced holistically. We're obviously embedded in a very strong movement towards sophisticated CRM systems, and RPO can help. It's our job, I think, to stay a little bit ahead in the learning curve here, and so it's our job to be out examining the next wave of technology sets. It's what we do for a living. Hence, as Jim mentioned, we were we believe we were the first RPO provider to latch on to Avature many years ago and help them think that through. We're doing that now again with the next wave of technology providers, so RPO players that do that for a living can help. The domain expertise is expected. It's not just a processing exercise anymore. It's really business level understanding of our client's environment and the domain that they operate in, and we're expected to bring that with us, and you should expect your vendors to bring that with you. We see some question mark around VMS as well, and we know this was a big trend in terms of vendor management systems and the big box ability, the ways they went to market and bought talent. We have a feeling that that may backfire. It's our supposition that relationships and process knowledge really do matter, and the VMS is eliminating those value drivers as part of the relationship between the buyer community and the vendor community. And we have a feeling that long term, our sense is that it will backfire as talent gravitates around those systems to their logical home, and the VMS platforms actually inhibit the free flow of knowledge transfer and candidate flow, and the best candidates and the best IP and knowledge will seek ways around VMS, and I think the ultimate intent of VMS could backfire. Global, we've already hit. That's coming. It's going to get even more profound. Continued consolidation and fragmentation would seem like opposites. They're not. With consolidation, there's gravity, and you're seeing a whole slew of new RPO providers and staffing firms that have turned themselves into RPO providers. You need to both welcome that as a buyer and be wary of it. Understand that there's actual true RPO vendors out there, and there's a lot of very fine firms that came at it from a different angle and may not be as steeped in real RPO domain expertise as those that have been in it for a long time. You're going to see a continued evolution in pricing models. This continues to be a real interesting conversation between the market and the provider community as to how to best find the sweet spot. There is a sweet spot emerging as to the exact cost per transaction and total cost of ownership of the recruitment function, and I think ultimately we will end in that place as we kind of tack
through all these different various pricing models, and I think we're getting closer and closer. And most importantly, and probably in closing, that this is all good. This is competition. This is innovation. It is driving performance into the buyer community world, and it's born out of all of these dynamics that are somewhat disruptive, but also very exciting for all the players in this space as we head through this this next wave of growth. David?
Okay, David, we're going to move on to our final question now. So if we can put that up on the screen for everybody to complete, what would you change about your current services? Select one of the following: cost, quality of candidates, technology, or other. We'd certainly appreciate everybody checking whichever box is appropriate for you so that we can get this final polling question completed. We'll give a couple seconds for that to happen. And I think we're just about there. Okay, that part's completed. We can move on to our final slide as far as questions and the contact information. We are running out of time. We've taken the questions as we move through, so if we can pull the next slide up, David, so that everybody can see that everyone's contact information. I would like to take this moment to thank David and Jim for sharing their experiences with us today, and for the Outsourcing Institute for hosting this webinar. I would also like to thank all of the participants on the call for taking time out of your schedules and joining us today. We'd like to wish all of you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy Holiday. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.